Welcome, everyone, to the 23rd Annual Grotius Lecture. This is always one of the highlights of the Society's annual meeting and one of my favorite events. It is an absolute pleasure to continue our partnership with the American University Washington College of Law in presenting this lecture, and we thank them for their continuing support. This year's lecture will be given by a longtime friend and member of the Society, the distinguished president of the Curatorium of the Hague Academy of International Law, Professor Yves Daudet. He has titled his remarks provocatively, "Never let a good crisis go to waste. Can international law seize the advantage?" Following his lecture, our distinguished discussant, Professor Hannah Buxbaum, Vice President for International Affairs at Indiana University, will deliver the response. And now, to welcome you and to introduce our speakers, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Professor Khadija Alai, Director of the International and Comparative Legal Studies Program at ASIL Academic Partner, American University, Washington College of Law. Khadija, a pleasure to see you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. On behalf of American University, Washington College of Law, I welcome you all to this 23rd Grotius Lecture. We really prize our partnership with American Society of International Law, and we are so looking forward to this lecture today. Although I do miss the sea of faces that we can see at the Grotius Lecture every year, I want to congratulate Catherine Amirfar, Mark A. Grass, Wes Reist, and all the ASIL crew for pivoting so wonderfully to have this conference both last year and this year online. This year, we are very, very fortunate, as Catherine mentioned, to have Professor Yves Daudet, currently the Emeritus Professor of Public International Law at Sorbonne Law School, providing us with the Grotius Lecture. He's also the president of the Curatorium of the Hague Academy of International Law since 2017. He has served as ad hoc judge of the International Court of Justice since 2012, and he is an arbitrator at the Court of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe since 2019. He's a former Secretary General of the Hague Academy of International Law from 2005 to 2017, the former first Vice President of the University of Paris-Sorbonne from 1999 till 2004. He studied at the University of Paris, including a master's and a doctorate in international law cum laude in 1967, receiving the PhD prize for his thesis, as well as the George Shell Prize. Over the course of his extensive career, he has been professor at universities of Rabat, Morocco, Caribbean, Martinique, Ivory Coast, and in Mauritius. In France, he held professorships at University of Aix-Marseille and University of Sorbonne. He's a former member of the editorial board of l'Anneur Français de Droit International. He has lectured in 50 countries and territories around the world. He has lectured at the Hague Academy of International Law, and he has received medals of honor from countries all over the world, including France, Netherlands, Chile, Peru, Germany, and Ivory Coast. His meticulous scholarship has had an important impact over the course of his more than 50 years long career. He has consistently researched and written about the evolution of sources of international law, the role of the United Nations, and how international law can contribute to maintain peace and security. So I can't think of a better person to speak today about what the challenges are and whether international law can meet us at this time. Our distinguished discussant is Professor Hannah Buxbaum. Hannah is the Vice President, as was mentioned, of International Affairs at Indiana University and Professor of Law and John E. Schiller Chair at Indiana University Moore School of Law. Professor Buxbaum's scholarship focuses on private international law and international litigation. She has held visiting appointments at a number of universities, including Humboldt University, the London School of Economics, and University Paris, and has delivered a course on international economic regulation at the Hague Academy of International Law. Professor Buxbaum is active, as we know, in the leadership of several professional and scholarly organizations, including ASIL, where she has served most recently as vice president. She's an elected member of the American Law Institute, International Academy of Comparative Law, and currently serves on the Curatorium of the Hague Academy of International Law. Again, welcome. And I'm going to now hand it over to our speaker, Professor Daudet.
Madam President of the American Society of International Law, I would like to begin by expressing to you and those around you, Dean Robert Dinerstein, Professor Padide and I, Professor Mark Agrast, and many others colleagues, I would like to express my immense gratitude and the deep honor and pleasure I feel at your invitation to deliver the so prestigious Grotius Lecture. I would like also to deeply thank Professor Padilla for her so kind presentation. She expressed two complimentary words, but it's always very pleasant to hear. So I am happy with that. Rendering now to Caesar what Caesar's, I thank Mark Agrast, who suggested that I use in this title a formula that he attributes to Churchill without guaranteeing its authenticity. But what does it matter? As the Italians say, se non è vero, è ben trovato. I must also apologize for my strong French accent, my mistakes, and for reading my paper more than I should, since I am not speaking in my native language. Ladies and gentlemen, some crises are circumscribed. Others are more diffuse, sometimes of varying intensity depending on the region. But at the end of the day, all the regions will be impacted according to an uncertain timetable. This is the case, for example, of the climate crisis. Others are latent and marked by sudden outbreaks, such as terrorism or Islamic State's criminal operations. Still others are to worsen, such as the migration crisis, which today are probably little compared to what they will be. We must also think about the financial and economic crisis, cybersecurity breaches. I have in mind the recent attack of Microsoft hackers, attack by hackers, possibly from China, misusing of new technologies and social networks, and importantly, the democratic crisis that the United States had just had the painful experience of. But the current dramatic health crisis is obviously the one that occupies everyone's mind today. The time we live in is marked by a phenomenon of accumulation and variety of this crisis, whose common characteristic is to be global. Thus, with regard to the health crisis, every state has a direct interest both in being informed of the situation elsewhere and in participating in joint action. Nevertheless, joint action does not and cannot exclude national action of its own in extreme circumstances. And for example, the recent decision of the United States to withhold COVID vaccine doses is quite understandable, even if it expresses the blocking effect of sovereignty and recalls the slogan, America First. Here we are at the heart of international law, having to ask ourselves what kind of international society we want and how should it be governed by principles and rules appropriate and adapted to a world that is no longer that of 1648 or even that of 1945. In 1648, when the treaties of Westphalia established the foundation of modern international law, the principle of equality of states and its corollary sovereignty was put forward. hence the expression sovereign equality, which would be enshrined three centuries later at Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the Charter. We know what is fictitious about this principle of sovereign equality. But it is quite certain that when it emerged in 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, it was a step forward from the situation in the world that had preceded it. Today, some minds question sovereignty itself, and some advocate its disappearance. I don't think that's an appropriate position. In fact, international society has evolved considerably. The principle of sovereignty of the state being its main pillar, I mean, the one towards which the other principles converge. This principle itself must evolve as well. And it is just a question of ensuring that sovereignty is given a content and characteristics that correspond to the needs of international society as it is at the 21st century, and thus continue to be the renewed pillar of a renewed international law. Even if the ICJ in the Barcelona Traction judgment referred to, I quote, the international community as a whole, unquote, it does not mean that a community of destinies based on uniform rules of law is easily achieved. However, a certain number of these rules is necessary, especially in time of crisis. They are, in the words of Edith Brown Weiss, I quote, the glue that binds together diverse states, communities, and individuals, unquote, in the kaleidoscopic world described in her extremely brilliant journal course recently delivered at the Hague Academy. As much as possible, let us look for this glue. It requires political will. International law is consubstantial with the political project. To ask whether international law can benefit from crisis is at first to ask what political project has been decided in the face of crisis and which lessons can be drawn from them. Then, with which mean enrich international law with it, so that in a preventive approach, it can be applied in the future. There is a voluntary aspect to these views. It is therefore a question of political will, which consists in seizing the opportunity provided by the major crisis we are currently experiencing. By their scale and universality, they are an opportunity not to be missed to accomplish this process of a real, I would say, restatement of international law. All of these crises ultimately reflect the crisis of globalization itself, and what could go on and on, enumerating them one after the other. I will not do so, nor go into the details of each crisis and the measures taken, contemplated, or simply desirable. Rather, I will confine myself to the general elements that seem to me to be at the heart of the question of whether international law can derive any benefit from crisis. For this purpose, I will emphasize that the crisis shows first that the central principle, sovereignty, must be adapted to the needs of today's world. Second, that multilateralism must be strengthened as a preferred instrument for organizing international society. I will treat these 2 points in turn. First, adapting the principle of sovereignty. Can the founding principle of sovereignty be adapted to respond also to the interest or even the rights of other states. As for the adjustment of the principle, the climate crisis is a very telling example. The harmful activities to environment in the Amazon rainforest, mainly by Brazil, illustrate perfectly well the conflict between the sovereignty of the state on one hand, and in the other hand, the interest of other states, and finally, the safeguarding of the planet of which Amazon forest is the lung. Brazil's territorial sovereignty is naturally not in doubt, but the compelling needs of the climate crisis mean that the ways in which Brazilian sovereignty is exercised must be adjusted to meet the balance. This kind of adjustment already exists, for example, in the law of the sea. The climate and environmental crisis have given rise to a formula that I would describe as an adapted sovereignty, aiming at implementing the no harm principle. Therefore, the territory must be used in a way that does not harm other states in accordance with the customary principle of environmental law recognized by the ICJ in its 1996 advisory opinion, Legality of the Use of Nuclear Weapons. This solution requires dialogue and negotiation through the addition of various norms, some of them legally binding or others only soft law, as well as doctrines such as the common concern of humankind. In that case, the whole process, which also includes a dose of pressure on states, is slow. It is very slow. But it is quite clear that the necessary reordering of a principle as founding as that of state sovereignty in order to bring it into line with the current situation of our planet, that has to be done very gradually and with great care. Conversely, the crisis in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda during its conflicts in the 1990s, because of their extreme gravity and the resurgence of genocide, gave a tremendous boost to the construction of international criminal justice, the codification of which was dragging on year after year at the International Law Commission. Within only a very few weeks, the Special Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda were created in 1993 by Security Council resolution. And the very quick next step was the Rome Statute and the ICC in 1998. And of course, this is a great change in the international landscape, whatever the position of such or such state regarding the statute of the ICC. I come now to the implementation arrangement. Today, sovereignty is often affected by a game of transfer of competence. Of course, a transfer of competence is not a transfer of sovereignty, but it does mean that in a given area, the state cannot act or cannot act alone. A typical example is that of the European Union, where, on my opinion, but it's my own opinion, the health crisis highlighted the disadvantage of not having put in place a common health policy that could have, I think, made it possible acting better and faster at the beginning of the crisis. Things are going better now, but at the beginning it was a disaster. The health crisis also showed how much the relationship between states and the WHO and the extent or nature of the latter's power needed to be rethought. In spite of the noble and ambitious terms of the preamble of its constitution, WHO was not equipped with the means to implement them. Indeed, the positive aspect of crisis is that they are revealing of what in usual time we are prevented from seeing, exactly the same way that during periods of lockdown, the absence of pollution allowed the Venetian to rediscover the blue of the lagoons, the Chinese in Beijing, the blue of the sky, while ducks were walking along in the streets in Paris. Thus, in the American Journal series of articles devoted to the health crisis recently published, two papers by Jose Alvarez and Eyal Benvenisti extremely clearly highlight the weaknesses revealed by the WHO and the remedies that it should or could be provided with. So I will not repeat here what they have analyzed perfectly and very convincingly. I therefore refer to their articles. I will only insist on the lack of impartiality of WHO vis-à-vis China and its delay in fulfilling its responsibilities at the beginning of the crisis. I suppose that we'll have exchange of views with the Director General tomorrow, I think. I'm not sure he will say exactly the same thing, but that's the interest of the debate. So I had finally planned to elaborate about the flexibility of the border as a limit of sovereignty, but time does not allow me to do otherwise and very rapidly mention one element only about the flexibility of the boundary. In addition to the total loss of meaning on the notion of border in the crisis of cyberspace and immaterial data, we all know that the border is inoperative in case of climatic disorders or ecological damages. And it is an illusory barrier to mass migration. Only populists see closing the border and erecting walls or laying barbed wire as a solution to migration crisis. It is an illusory solution in the short term and an untenable solution when the crisis develops, which will be inevitable when the growing number of political and economic refugees will be joined by the cohort of climate refugees. Conversely, the total and unrestricted opening of borders is not realistic either, and states must remain free to regulate access to their territory in compliance with the refugee regime and the principle of non-discrimination. How then to make it possible people remain safe in their own country and thus also ensure international security? The solution to the migration crisis lies in multilateral action to develop regional or general cooperation and implement appropriate human rights programs. Coincidentally, listening to the French radio this morning, I was interested to hear that this approach should be that of President Joe Biden, also concerning the situation of undocumented migrants already in the United States. This new policy being fortunately in total rupture or total break maybe with the brutality and inhumanity of the previous administration. This brings me to my second point, strengthening the instruments of multilateralism. There are several reasons why a critical situation can only be addressed through multilateral action and collective effort. It may simply be because the crisis affects the entire planet. This is the case with the climate crisis or the health crisis. It may be because the fight against the crisis requires cooperation, for example, in the area of migration or for intelligence or law enforcement purposes in the case of fight against terrorism. It may be because as a result of unfortunate decisions, the multilateral movement having been damaged, returning to a broader dialogue will attempt to restore it. This restoration work is topical after Donald Trump's presidency. In a way, Donald Trump in himself has been a global crisis of international life and consequently of international law. However, during his term of office, when multilateralism was undermined as never before, there was never so much talk about multilateralism to praise its necessity for establishing peace. In this respect, the denunciation of the Paris Climate Agreement was emblematic of the international tension generated by such a decision. And it is highly symbolic that President Joe Biden, after the announcement during his campaign, chose the very day of his inauguration to bring the United States back into the Paris Agreement. The symbolic force of the return decision in this context has been multiplied tenfold. Moreover, many analysts said that from then on, the United States will take the lead in the Paris Agreement. And this was confirmed by Mr. John Kerry during a visit he paid to Paris on March 11, insisting on the duty of example of the United States in the multilateral concert at the International Summit to be held in Washington on the 23rd April next. The relief due to the election, and I say relief, due to the election of Joe Biden, boosted the Paris Agreement and magnified their importance more than if this crisis did not happen. Clearly, it contributed to the development of an international environment and law through multilateralism perceived as the best instrument. This can be seen in the energy that Boris Johnson announces he wants to deploy in the preparation of the COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021, aiming at making it a success and not only a success for UK. It is also reflected in statements made by Emmanuel Macron. No less significant was the reaction of Angela Merkel welcoming a reinforced multilateralism by John Biden's election and giving the example of Paris Agreement. And I may recall that this evening in France, in Europe, President Biden will join the head of state and government of European Union for a joint session, which is a sign, a very interesting sign, what will happen or not happen, but it is per se extremely interesting. For lack of time, I will not stop at the other situation I have already mentioned, health, climate, migration, etc., where the solution to the crisis, because of its very nature, necessarily involves multilateral actions and induces a development of multilateralism in general, which reinforces international law. Instead, I would like to rapidly dwell on an extremely serious and worrying crisis regarding the constitutional order of many states. Although it is an internal crisis, it affects international order. I am referring to the crisis of democracy in the sense of a crisis of the concept of democracy itself, as we inherited it from the philosophy of the Enlightenment in Europe in the 18th century or in the United States from the founding fathers. No need to speak at length about the still President Donald Trump's call to march on the Capitol. In a democracy, the power of symbols is immense. And beyond the dead, for there were some on that day, the actions taken in Washington were a desecration of the notion of democracy itself. Nevertheless, the situation is not unique to the United States. The populisms of a Bolsonaro in Brazil and Erdogan in Turkey, or Hungarian or Polish leaders and others are in the same vein. It is, in these cases, the politicians themselves who, through a populist approach, question the rules of democracy. Elsewhere, the same populist movement took place with the important difference that they were not launched by the head of state himself. I'm thinking of Yellow Vest in France 2 years ago, or in the UK, some elements of populism in the Brexit campaign. This situation, which take place in internal settings, are of interest to international order for two reasons. First, we know the replica effect of imitation and contagion of situation born in one place that spread to others thanks to the current means of transport and communication, the internet and social networks or various platforms. If dictatorial regimes block the use of the internet, it is not only to keep secret what is happening at home, but also to prohibit knowledge of what is happening elsewhere. The second reason that more clearly affects international law itself in the impact of this situation, or what has sometimes been called democratic intervention, quote unquote. For sure, we still live under the regime of non-intervention and the right of each state to adopt, I quote, political, economic, and social system of its choice, unquote, to use the well-known formula of the Declaration of Friendly Relations. Since 1970, however, the situation has changed considerably. As I said earlier, sovereignty is more and more framed by human rights. The question therefore arises as to whether international law should remain powerless in the face of this democratic crisis, or whether there may be ways to address it on the basis of experiences from the recent crisis. What is the variety of means? Health crisis, climate crisis, migration crisis, democratic crisis will not be addressed by the same kind of instrument aiming at their treatment. Remedying certain critical situations may require a technical decision. Others may require a completely different approach. Taking the example of the crisis of democracy, it does not require technical answers, but rather the opening of complex debates on the meaning of words, on diagnosis, on solutions and possibilities of their implementation. The very opportunity to open a dialogue through the message it carries can raise questions. This is the case regarding the project of a summit on democracies announced by President Joe Biden. In this respect, some minds in Europe have dubbed that the United States, after the events in the Capitol, has retained any credibility in defending democracy. I think this is totally wrong, totally wrong. On the contrary, President Biden and Americans in general are very well placed to be aware of the risks involved and to talk about them. They are conscious of the fragility of democracy, even in a very large country traditionally attached to these values. We will see what comes out of this summit. But in my views, this simple announcement strengthens democracy and human rights, and thus ultimately international law itself. Since these issues require pedagogy and exchange of views, multilateral summits are appropriate frameworks for doing so. A recent example of this type of action is that of the Alliance for Multilateralism, an informal network or a forum for discussion launched by Germany and France in 2019, bringing together some 40 states to exchange views on stability and peace. Obviously, since it was at that time the Donald Trump presidency, the United States do not participate in this meeting, which is quite regrettable, but maybe it will, I hope it will change in the future. I think that there was a meeting in Columbia or Georgetown University. I think it's Columbia University, where there was an exchange of views of this, this group. So I think something may happen in the future. This method has been followed by the United Nations since 1990s during large annual summits on major issues. You remember human rights, women, social development, refugees, etc. These conferences or summits generally do not adopt any fundamental document relating to the crisis or problems dealt with, but from declaration of principle, repeated declaration, action plans, they constitute a whole which, by adding and repeating the element it contains, expresses a certain consensus. It might ensure a sufficient degree of maturity, quote unquote, on the issue, as was said at the time of the League of Nations, making it possible the emergence at some point of an international custom or a regulation. This question of the means of multilateralism is a difficult one. The United Nations is not always where one would expect it to be. Thus, the silence of the Security Council during the COVID health crisis speaks for itself. The General Assembly did hold a very short special session on December 3 and 4, 2020, during which, by the way, the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, launched the interesting idea of an international treaty on pandemics, a treaty on pandemics. This weakness of the institution of multilateralism raises questions. However, broadening the spectrum over the last 100 years, it shows a global progress of international law through multilateralism. From the major crises of the two world wars came to the League of Nations and the United Nations. Imperfect, but progressing in relation to each other, and the institutional multilateralism of the United Nations has often avoided the worst. No one today can seriously question the need for the United Nations. I have given several examples of crises that have strengthened multilateralism or made it possible. Much more could have been said on this very broad theme, but it's time now to conclude. The many crises we are currently facing offer us the opportunity to reflect on the future of our planet and the rights of those who are on it, human beings, but also, I take care not forget them, animals, and even inanimate living elements. We need to be aware of crises, which by their gravity and likely repetition represent serious threats. They require collective, coordinated, or organized efforts that, as the case may be, are based on new rules to deal with them, but also not to be caught off guard in the future. This is why I've spoken of a preventive aspect in the exit from crisis. I think that a serious crisis, such as the current health crisis, which day after day disrupts lives and makes our future uncertain, justifies an in-depth reflection and a philosophical approach like that of the painter Paul Gauguin. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going to? Regarding international law, the reflections are necessary if we want to establish real changes that are needed on solid foundations. The lived experience that can then be a guarantee for the future and then an enrichment. Therefore, under these conditions, crises can benefit international law. In this vein, the current health crisis raises questions on the concept of solidarity. All countries are concerned with the crisis. All countries are equal, but they are not all equal in face of crisis. Poor countries do not have an easy access to vaccine that they cannot pay for. Their population is not vaccinated, even though it is imperative that vaccination be general on the planet. Many voices are calling for vaccines to be a global public good and patents be taken out. This is a divisive issue for WTO. Apart from the possible use of patent waivers, this might be an opportunity to think about other patent systems adapted to situations like a COVID, and therefore to improve the rules of international law in this respect, since crises of this kind will repeat. Be sure we will have other COVID crises in the future. The issue should be dealt with a new way, taking into account in a balanced way the legitimate interests of laboratories, the financial needs of research and possible public support. I remind that the United States gave $12 billion for the research for laboratories with this very rapid delivery of vaccines. It would render possible support as well as the perspective of richest countries and then given to the poorest, notably by the WHO and COVAX program. Whatever the system, it is in our common interest. It is in our common interest because, to quote again Edith Byrne-Weiss, we are all in the same boat. And if one of us makes a hole in the hull, the whole boat sinks. This is why I think that if we are not united out of morality, we are united out of necessity. I am not sure that is well understood at the moment about the health crisis. Generally speaking, the penetration into international law of a principle of solidarity, which does not mean that it excludes all consideration of national interest when vital interests are at stake. But I mean, the penetration of this principle of solidarity is therefore a topic that jurists should think about, not only for moral or humanitarian, humanist reasons, which would be respectable as such, but simply because the nature of the crisis we are going through require that they not be allowed to amplify in a place from which they would threaten the world. In a way, solidarity is another face of general interest, which in turn is another face of security. To conclude, I would say that while crises are painful, they also reveal our needs and aspirations for change, and they help us to design a future based on rule of international law, well adapted to our needs in our future in a changing world. So the future. Since we are in the United States, where dreams have a meaning and are an incentive for taking action, whether it is the American dream or that of Martin Luther King, we cannot be accused of living with our heads in the clouds when looking towards the future with hope, voluntarism, and a good dose of optimism. Thank you.
I would like to begin by thanking the Society and the American University Washington College of Law for the invitation to participate in this event today. I am truly honored to join Professor Daudet for this session. He has contributed so much to our field, and including through his commitment to international law education, particularly as Secretary General of the Hague Academy of International Law, and now the president of its curatorium. It is my honor to work with him on that board, and I'm delighted to join him today to contribute some thoughts on his inspiring lecture. Through the lens of current crises, including the climate crisis, the crisis of democracy, and of course the COVID pandemic, Professor Daudet examines the role that international law plays in mediating the principle of national sovereignty and the interests of the global community. And he asks whether these crises might in some way create an opportunity to advance the international legal and political order. To some extent, that inquiry echoes and builds upon studies of international law's response to past crises. For example, the wartime atrocities that generated a move toward universal human rights and the attendant expansion of state responsibility. But Professor Daudet focuses in particular on global crises, which, as he notes, are becoming increasingly common. The problems or crises that we describe as global, this pandemic, the financial crisis of the late 2000s, climate change, transcend the national or regional scale. They implicate the transnational flows of people, of capital, of manufacturing, that characterize the contemporary economy, and so they cannot be solved without confronting the interdependencies among states that make uncoordinated national solutions inadequate. Professor Daudet argues that such crises, by virtue of their scale and universality, create an opportunity to strengthen and operationalize the principle of solidarity in international law. An international order with the principle of solidarity in the foreground would, in his words, adapt the concept of sovereignty, requiring states to consider the impact of their actions and policies on other states and on the international community as a whole. And it would highlight the collective responsibility of states to serve the interests of humanity in the face of shared challenges. Most critically, in his view, it would reinforce and privilege multilateralism as the bedrock of the international order. This is a powerful call coming on the heels of recent attacks on the core foundations and institutions that support the multilateral regime. Professor Daudet invokes a multilateralism for the global age, building on and extending the shift from the law of coexistence to the law of cooperation observed by Wolfgang Friedmann already in the mid-1960s. It is a capacious form of multilateralism, encompassing, as Professor Daudet has written elsewhere, the means of expression of international law, the means of operation of international law, the very institution of international law. And it is an inclusive form of multilateralism, including a commitment to strong international institutions, but seeking also the robust engagement of non-governmental organizations and even individuals. Again, in the tradition of Friedmann, Professor Daudet recognizes that the solidarity that can drive multilateralism emerges not only as a moral response to the human condition, but as a necessary functional response to the problems that arise within current social and economic structures. And here again is where the potential opportunity lies for international law. By focusing attention on our collective destiny, perhaps global crises can create a tipping point of sorts, not only fortifying the value of solidarity, but accelerating its penetration into international law and institutions. I would like to consider this possibility with particular reference to the COVID crisis, which so well exemplifies the developments Professor Daudet discusses. Now, the story of this crisis is, of course, still being written. And rather than imprudently committing myself to any predictions about the aftermath of the pandemic, I will simply make a few observations about the current state of pandemic response. My goal is to consider where we see multilateralism at work, where it faces challenges, and whether an intensified commitment to solidarity can be traced. I will start by noting that the discourse around the pandemic is framed almost entirely in terms of the need for solidarity and cooperation. That is, of course, only rhetoric, but as Professor Daudet noted in connection with another crisis, the crisis of democracy, the expression of values can itself be a manifestation of multilateralism. And where are we in terms of action? The development of effective vaccines was fast and enormously successful. It was also due almost entirely to unilateral action on the part of individual states. High-income countries were able and willing to make massive investments in pharmaceutical companies through actions like Operation Warp Speed in the United States, knowing that it would benefit their citizens. They were also able to bring state power to bear in supporting the development and manufacture of vaccines, most directly by using emergency procurement authority to commandeer local production facilities. As a result, there is now a portfolio of effective vaccines. That brings us to the current challenge of ensuring access to these vaccines worldwide, including in countries lacking the structural capacity just described or sufficient purchasing power to compete for vaccines on the open market. That will involve mobilizing resources in a way that recognizes and addresses the persistent gap in equity between the global North and the global South. Here we see, I think, the ghost of solidarity. International development law and policy were initially oriented around that principle, the notion that it was in the common interest of all states to advance economic development around the world. That value of solidarity infused the new international economic order and its institutions. But the post-Cold War turn to the principles of neoliberalism, deregulation, market orientation, eroded that commitment, resulting in the progressive deconstruction, as Georges Abissab has written, of the normative framework of development law. An exemplar of that shift is the WTO Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights, which controversially included medicines within its scope, resulting in patent protection for treatments. This is, as Professor Daudet also mentioned, merely one of the barriers today facing lower income countries that seek to participate in the manufacturing and delivery of vaccines. It is here, I think, that the COVID crisis indeed presents an opportunity for a renewed focus on solidarity and a stronger multilateralism. Ensuring vaccine access worldwide is not only about improving conditions in particular localities. A failure to contain the pandemic anywhere will have health and economic consequences everywhere. The welfare of the global North and the global South are linked, generating a truly collective interest in addressing this challenge. Some developments indicate a turn towards solidarity. Negotiations are underway at the WTO regarding possible waivers of certain IP protections, suggesting at least the possibility of revisiting some of the imbalances of the current regime. Moreover, the COVAX facility, a public-private partnership established last April by the World Health Organization, has established a program under which countries can both fund vaccine production and donate surplus vaccine for eventual distribution worldwide. This does reflect a pivot away from the facility's initial focus, which was to pool financial contributions from member states to collectivize the development and distribution of vaccines, a strategy that would have ensured simultaneous access by middle and lower income countries. But it is nevertheless a shift toward the collective resolution of the crisis, with nearly 200 countries now participating. At the same time, the gravitational pull of national interests remains strong. This week, we are seeing that in conflicts involving the export of vaccines that could be used to immunize local citizens, including, for example, in the dispute between the EU and the UK. But that has been a theme throughout the pandemic. And each state surely does have the right to mobilize whatever resources it has to support its own population. Moreover, it's worth noting that as a state considers its role in serving the global collective welfare, it may also confront challenges in serving the internal collective welfare. In countries like the United States, where the pandemic has had disparate impact on particular communities, it is imperative to direct resources toward addressing that disparity. So, despite the undeniable interdependence of state interests, and despite serious commitment to collective action, there will at the very least remain questions about how to sequence local and collective action. What all of this reminds us is that the move toward multilateralism comes from the states. It is, as Professor Daudet says, a voluntary move, a political move. And the clearer it becomes that both our humanity and our security depend on collective action, the sooner it will happen. This circles us back to the question whether the current crises present an opportunity to accelerate that move. Can we endorse Professor Daudet's optimism that international law will be able to seize an advantage? I think so, and let me explain and conclude by returning to his suggestion that the scale and universality of global crises can engender a commitment to solidarity that will drive multilateral engagement. The pandemic, in particular, has salient attributes beyond scale and universality. First, its impact is being felt now, unlike the climate crisis, which is existentially pressing, but from which it is easier to distance ourselves because many of its worst consequences will be felt only in the future. Second, the impact of the pandemic is deeply personal. Although in different ways and to different degrees, it has altered our lived experience, both as a community, but also as individuals. The solidarity it engenders is immediate and universal. May it also be lasting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This does bring us to a close, but let me just say, I'd like to thank Professor Daudet for an outstanding Grotius lecture. Your themes of, to use your words, adapted sovereignty, the fragility of democracy, the means of multilateralism, are themes that you've so eloquently treated, and the nuance of them are questions that we will be exploring. And I suspect that your lecture is going to be cited and quoted as we continue to think about them. And Professor Buxbaum, for an equally thoughtful treatment of those themes. You know, I take note on the focus on collective destiny that has been thrust upon us in this pandemic, and perhaps why it's different than other collective destiny moments like climate change, and the acceleration that could mean, and the questions that you posit are obviously fundamental. Well, let me embrace your embrace of the optimism, but I do want to thank both of you for such a wonderful treatment and an inspiring Grotius lecture. And indeed, many of these themes will be taken up by the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, who we'll be hearing from later today at 3 p.m. Eastern. So I look forward to that, and I invite everyone to join us for that. And last but not least, Professor Lai, thank you so much for once again hosting, for once again being a partner with the Society. We always enjoy our collaborations, as you know, and this is why, because we get this kind of quality of scholarship. Thank you, everyone. And everyone out there, we look forward to seeing you in the sessions to come.